All right, I think we'll wait a few more minutes before we get started.
And while waiting, I would like to welcome everyone for this Lexia Growth Academy webinar this morning. My name is Maria Story, and I have my colleague Juuso Turtiainen with me as well.
Hi, I'm Juuso Turtiainen, also presenting today. I am an associate in the ITM team, working with tech and startup companies, and pretty much any other company that can come through our doors.
Yeah, I work in the same team with Juuso, mainly focus on intellectual property matters in my day-to-day jobs, but also work with startups. And as you know, with startups, you can get any kind of requests. So we'll help with any problems they might face. Should we get started? And this is a very kind of informal webinar. So if you have any questions or like to discuss about something, just, please just give us a shout and we can discuss. So very, very informal and we welcome any discussion in the end or in the middle, doesn't matter.
Yeah. All right. So it is now 2 minutes past 9. So I think we can get started with the presentation. So again, welcome to Lexia Growth Academy episode with regards to shareholder agreements, especially from the perspective of founders. We'll be going through essentially the main clauses and things to consider with regards to the main clauses, as well as the stumbling blocks that companies face or have faced with regards to shareholder agreements. And then we'd like to, of course, hear from you and hear from your experiences. But yes, let's get started.
Perfect. So shareholders agreement is vitally important. So all the parties understand the common rules of operating the company. So those things, kind of common rules, will include the ownership, the management, the development of the business. So in a nutshell, what kind of percentages every shareholders owns from the company, how the company is managed, are there any outside managers to help to run the company smoothly, and of course how the business is developed. So all these three things require consensus between the shareholders in order to promote the interest of the company. And of course, this kind of common consensus will help with the smooth running as well. And like even these like kind of basic things, you might think like between the shareholders that you agree and you're on the same page, but the better you draft the shareholders agreement, the less problems it might cause in the end if there's any arguments or different views. So all of these, even the little things, has to be kind of discussed and decided, even though of course you want to run the company the same way and you have the same goals, but these are important things to discuss. The shareholders agreement also grants rights and requires commitments from the shareholders. It requires basically the key people to commit the company. We'll talk later a bit more about the technical side of it, how to kind of commit them and what happens if someone is not pulling their weight. Like I mentioned before, that it kind of a good shareholders agreement creates certainty and predictability, and this obviously prevents disputes. And because the agreement already sets out the rules by which the shareholders must follow. Of course, any shareholder is probably better than none. So even if it's just discussing with your shareholders and making sure that there's the basic things is still better than nothing. But obviously, the better the shareholder agreement it is, it's easier to avoid disputes and any other arguments later on. I'm gonna hit that next slide, Juuso.
Yep. So to go on to who are the parties in a shareholders agreement and who makes the decisions within the company. essentially, a shareholder agreement is entered into by the company's major shareholders. So here, at the initial stage, this will be the co-founders. And essentially, the co-founders need to create the rules, and not just from the perspective of now we are only here with a group of 2, 3, 4 people, but what will happen in the future and how sort of the company will develop and what needs to be taken into consideration with regards to future events. So from especially the perspective of potential new shareholders, what happens when key employees are coming on board and you want to incentivize them to stay with the company, or you bring on investors or advisors into the company, and how the shares are sort of distributed between these parties. So again, talking about potential new shareholders here, key employees would be, for example, a company bringing on a CTO who you want to incentivize to stick with the company. So essentially making the key employee more committed to the company by giving them a percentage of the company. Then of course, bringing on investors where you want to scale the company, and as well as then advisors where possibly even before bringing on investors, you have people who give their time and effort to give you an understanding of where the company might be most productive and where your product or service might grow the best. And in return for their time and effort, often a shareholding is given. So these are usually and generally the potential new shareholders of the company, of course, not taking into consideration possible option pools for key employees or investors or advisors or board members. So essentially the key matters to consider regarding the new shareholders when they come on board is how do these new shareholders adhere to the shareholders agreement? So in that sense, often joining the main shareholders agreement, especially when there are more than 5, more than 10 shareholders, it becomes very hard to make decisions, hard to make possible changes to the actual shareholder agreement. So especially with possible new key employees, some parties that are essentially employees that you want to keep on board, it might be easier for them to adhere to the shareholders agreement via a minority shareholders agreement or an adherence agreement. So here with the minority shareholders agreement, you might have tighter rules as well that you might not want the co-founders or investors to tie on to. So for example, non-compete clauses that are stricter than it is with co-founders. The same goes for adherence agreements. So you might on certain clauses want to have certain matters that are a bit different than the main shareholders agreement, but it may be faster to tie new investors or new shareholders to the shareholders agreement by an adherence agreement, so that you don't have to make any changes to the main shareholders agreement. So this is something to consider with regards to. All right, it seems I've gone offline.
I can still hear you, but now the slides went away.
Some reason.
Okay, yeah, just one.
Are they back?
Yes, it's back. Just have to make it bigger. There we go. Okay.
Yes. All right. Perfect. Then going on to sort of the maximum share of these shareholders. So essentially, how much are you willing to give of the company to these shareholders? So something to think about beforehand prior to taking on new shareholders. What is the sort of ownership and what is the decision-making power that you're handing over to the new parties? But at the same time, it might be a good thing to consider whether things do change over the course of the business, and at some point someone will leave. So at the point when someone leaves, how much can they take of the shareholding with them? So in that sense, being able to control the share pool is a key and vital matter. Then going on to the actual governance and decision-making of the company. A vital matter to discuss and to decide on is the composition of the decision-making bodies, especially with regards to the board of directors. So here, how many board members are in the board of directors? Is it 2? Is it 3, 4, 5, 6, and in that sense, who has the right to decide on the board of directors. So often when investors come on board, investors wish to have the right to select a board member to represent the decision of the investors. And in that sense, it is good to understand how much that will affect or may affect the decision-making process in general. So then going on to the decision-making process itself, how will decisions be made within the company? Is it with a simple majority where 51% of the shareholders or board members, where the decision made by a board member or board members is decided by those who have more than 50% of decision-making power? Or is it a qualified majority where 2/3 of the decision-making power needs to be behind the decision for it to be passed? Especially the qualified majority side should be considered on matters that are vital and important for the company to go forward. So for example, an exit situation, a new shareholder, an investor coming on board, may be something that requires more weight behind the actual decision and requires more than just one or two shareholders to decide on the matter. Also, then there are veto rights that can be included. So veto rights for the co-founders in certain matters to essentially ensure that the company is going in the direction where the co-founders wish the company to go, or vice versa with investors who wish to have veto rights with regards to their investment, and understandably so that they know where their investment is going and that they have some form of control over the decision-making process. Then to go on, Maria.
So what is agreed in the shareholders agreement? Of course, the goals of the parties. Like I mentioned before, it's vital that all the shareholders have the same view where the company is taken to. For example, the goals can be just a massive exit or increasing the value and recognition of the company, or for example, bringing some products or services that are for the general good to consumers. For example, like a new kind of innovation that will help people or something similar to that. And as there can be several goals or only one kind of major goal, it's vital that all the parties are on the same page on this one. And it's especially is important when there's more shareholders kind of coming and joining along, or investors. So again, in order to avoid any disputes later on, even all the new ones, new shareholders or investors has to be like on the same page and know where the company is taken to. And then obviously the ownership of the company and any changes in the ownership. So here I mentioned before quickly about the technical side of it. So for example, you have to kind of discuss about any restrictions on the transferring the shareholders. For example, if there's any divorce or even death amongst the shareholders, you should discuss, and what is usually decided is that the company can buy the shares off, so they don't go to a third party outside the company. And again, like Juuso was saying about like kind of keeping an eye on the share pool. So yeah, usually they would go to the company, they would initially receive the right to the shares, and then from there, for example, you can decide that the shareholders can purchase them in the same, like within the same percentage they already own in shares. It's called pro rata. So yeah, you need to discuss about what happens even in the most unlikely events, that what happens to the shares. And also the business of the company and its development. I did touch this matter in the first slide a little bit, but you have to kind of jointly agree upon the business plan, the key principle of doing business, and also what is very important is the financing of the company. So is there any obligation amongst the shareholders to participate on the capitalization, for example, to give a loan to the company, or is it just generally from the backbone of the shareholders? So So we can agree that no one is like required to dig up their own pockets to kind of finance the company, but you can just do the work in, or to get like I agree that you take a loan from, I don't know, Finvera or somewhere else. So yeah, this is a very important issue. That, and also if you do agree that all the shareholders will participate, then yeah, it's good to write it down. So if someone doesn't, then you know where you stand. Yeah. So do you want to continue the next one?
Sure. Then to go on to certain special rights and obligations of the parties. Essentially, first, the obligations, general obligations of confidentiality. So you wish to keep the matters that are discussed within shareholder meetings, between the workers and employees of the company as confidential. So it is good to set this out, not just in employment agreements or have an NDA between the founders, but also to be set in stone in the shareholders agreement, so that it applies to also the founders or any new shareholder that comes along. Also, then matters of non-competition and non-solicitation. So non-competes can often be a matter that requires a bit more discussion, especially when bringing on advisors and investors, as they may have or usually do have some sort of other commitments, whereas the non-compete itself could be essentially applied to these commitments. And you do not want to be in a situation where a advisor cannot advise you, or the advisor may not want to join the shareholders and become an advisor if they are bound not to compete in any way, directly or indirectly, with the company. So this is something that often may require discussion or may require exemptions. So setting out a list of companies that all the parties agree that it is okay for the advisor or for someone else to participate in. But at the same time, this might be a stumbling block where there really is no decision that can be made to go forward with a certain party, and that it isn't okay for let's say an advisor to participate in advising a competitor. So this is something that will bring up often discussion, especially when bringing on new shareholders. Also, non-solicitation. Essentially, as is with life, things do change, and a shareholder may, and possibly and most likely will, leave the company at some point. So you do not want to be in a situation where the shareholder, especially if they leave in a state of uncontent, not very happy with the other shareholders or with the direction of the company, and want to cause an issue with the company. So in that sense, having a clause which essentially prevents said shareholder from soliciting the employees with them, soliciting their team to come join with the shareholder in a new company. So you want to protect also your assets, which are the employees in that sense. Then going on to drag along and tag along clauses. So essentially the obligation or the right to co-sell. So in a situation where, for example, an exit situation where a party wishes to buy the company as a whole, or at least the majority of the company, with regards to the obligation to co-sell, so the drag along right. Here we discuss, for example, a situation where a party wishes to buy 90% of the shares and the minority shareholders own the last 10%. So if the outside party wishes to control the full company, with the drag along clause, there is the right to force the minority shareholders to sell the shares, as well as then a tag along situation where a majority is being sold, giving essentially the right to co-sell the shares. Then, as previously mentioned, investor rights. Essentially, the board seat is one, as well as the veto right. And these are some matters that usually come up when bringing on investors, as investors, of course, want to have some control over their investment, and in that sense, be in a situation where they can also influence the direction of where the company is going, which is understandable, especially if the investment is large. And in that sense, have the right to affect decision-making, have the right to veto certain decisions. But then again, this is something to consider, especially where the co-founders have a direct vision, and is often a situation where issues arise, especially in a situation where the co-founders or the founders and an investor's sort of vision for the company differs a lot and may cause some friction between the investors and the co-founders. And in that sense, it may be an issue to discuss before bringing on investors, whether you want to hand over the veto right to an investor to certain decisions, which can also affect the pace of decision making. Also, with regards to investors, often preferential shares are a part of the rights that are given to investors and very often requested by investors. So creating a new share pool for investors that are preferred to other shares. So you essentially have a common shares which have the same rights, one-to-one votes, one-to-one right to the profit, while then preferential shares might have the right to the assets a bit before others. So these are some of the rights that are given to investors. Then also, of course, intellectual property rights are matters that need to be set out in the shareholders agreement, especially from the point of view that in Finland, the work for hire concept doesn't apply. So essentially, an employee has the right to the intellectual property rights they created, which is why this needs to, or the shareholder in that matter, and which is the reason why it is important to set this down in the shareholders agreement, so that all the intellectual property rights created for the company, for the project the company is doing, is transferred over to the company, and not to a specific, that it's not left with a specific person, with a specific employee or shareholder. And we'll go on the matter a bit later. Then going on to working obligations. So essentially co-founders, when starting a company, each may have their sort of, especially when it's a group of friends, have their own idea of what they will be doing on behalf of the company to get the company going. But in that sense, it may be good to, especially when the shareholders are not a group of friends, or even in a situation where there are a group of friends, to set down the certain working obligations of the parties, maybe write it down in the shareholder agreement so that it is clear and that there is no issues in the future with regards to who does what and on what basis. And as Maria said in the beginning, this is a matter that often becomes an issue between the founders, or later on where someone cannot pull their own weight. So in that sense, also going to the vesting concept, which is essentially something that has come from the US, where certain shares, certain ownership for a certain percentage of shares is only transferred based on the amount of work provided and based on time in the company, essentially working to incentivize the let's say shareholders who are in the company and who may not have the same percentage, or then to have the shareholders incentivized to keep on working for the company, especially at the point where an investment might come in. And often this is a situation that investors request. So although essentially when co-founders start the company owning all the shares, an investor might request that there is a vesting clause to be added, which means essentially that the investor wants to tie the shareholders, the co-founders, to the company so that they continue working as passionately and as hard for the company for the next 3 to 4 years, and so that the investor's investment doesn't go to waste. Going on to the good and bad leaver clause. Now, this is often a matter that requires a lot of discussion, especially when a outside shareholders comes in. Let's say a key employee comes in, and this is a matter that often requires a bit of explanation to someone who has not been a part of a shareholders agreement before, or understands what a good bad leaver clause is. So essentially a situation where a good leaver would be the company has gone forward, but the services of a certain key employee aren't required. So the company wishes to let said shareholder and employee go. what are the terms on which the shares can be bought back, and essentially leaving the situation in a sense that both parties are at least somewhat acceptable of the result which has taken place. Bad leaver clauses are left for situations where the parties are not in a good situation. Essentially, that for example, a shareholder employee has a working shareholder has breached the agreement. So, on what terms can there be some sort of sanctions for said breach, or the said employee or shareholder has decided to leave the company on their own decision, and on what basis can said shareholder shares be essentially clawed back to the company at a price that doesn't affect the company's company going forward, or possible situation that the company is now in, let's say funding wise. So this is essentially to combat a situation where a person's let's say life situation has changed. They have decided that working for a startup is not fun, or is not what they actually dreamed about, and actually want to go off and surf in Bali. These clauses are there to handle this situation, so that everyone knows the rules by which a certain shareholder can leave the company. Then going on to procedural rules, how should disputes be resolved? Do you go to court when there's a dispute? Do you go to arbitration? Do you try and mediate? So essentially, of course, especially when there are co-founders involved, and this is a matter of principle, it might be a good idea to essentially have a mediation or a negotiation, at least for a certain period, to discuss matters and try and find a mutually beneficial decision, so that the company can go forward without any court cases, without any actual use of money for courts or for arbitration. So it is a good idea to try and settle matters in good faith, and in a sense that every party is at least as happy as they can be with the situation. But sometimes there needs to also be a sanction for a breach of the agreement, and especially in situations where it is a clear breach of the agreement, or you want to sort of protect the company, that any shareholder does not start thinking that, yes, this is just easy to breach the agreement, and I can go forward from there and try and get my own benefit. So often sanctions are the fines, let's say a certain amount for each breach that the shareholders has committed, as well as then the application of the bad leaver clause, or even stricter breach clause, where the shares are clawed back for no monetary value at all. So the idea is to discourage the breaching of the agreement. This is often tied to, for example, non-compete, non-solicitation, confidentiality breaches. So these are just ways of making sure that everybody is working for the benefit of the company, and as well as then to have a mechanism by which to sanction a breaching shareholder in a situation such as the ones mentioned before. And then the shareholders agreement is often followed or closed with the other provisions in that sense. So on what basis can amendments be made, essentially with all parties having or agreeing on said amendments and signing the amendments into force. How are notices given? So is it with 7 days by post? Is it by email? So this is important, especially in a situation where you might not be able to get into contact with a shareholder who is no longer interested in working for the company, or has lost interest and is not responding to anything. Having notices and the periods when a notice can be deemed to be received is extremely important in such a situation. Also, that the entire agreement is set out within the shareholders agreement, and that no oral agreement or other written agreement that has been made before the shareholder agreement is valid anymore, because you want to avoid conflicts with such agreements and such discussions before, as well as then have the actual agreement, what all shareholders are agreeing to within the agreement, so that there are no side agreements. And finally, severability, which essentially means that if any clause within the agreement is invalid or unenforceable under the law, then the parties will try and find a clause with which to replace it, but also that the invalidity or unenforceability of a certain clause does not affect the agreement in general, so that you can go forward with the shareholders agreement and then amend the certain clause so that you have the correct sort of under the law, the correct clause under the law being applied. Then going on to the most common stumbling blocks. Maria, do you want to take the first?
Yes. So like we mentioned before, that all of the issues and kind of clauses that we've been through over this half an hour or so could lead to a possible dispute between the shareholders. So yeah, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's important that you try and make as clear shareholders agreement as possible to create some certainty and obviously avoid disputes between the shareholders. But essentially, like anything could come to a dispute. And even in the beginning, if you have like clear consensus with your fellow shareholders, over the years the views might change, and even the most clearer things might come as an disagreement between the shareholders. So yeah, essentially anything could come to a dispute later on. So yeah, disputes between the shareholders are the most common kind of roadblock or stumbling block what comes to shareholders agreements. Also IPRs. So like Juuso mentioned before, it's important to create the shareholder agreement and also just employment contracts in a way that all the IPRs that are created by a person will transfer to the company. And related to IPRs, they might be very good idea to agree on a lump sum or something if you create very beneficial, for example, I don't know, design or something like that, that you get some kind of lump sum for it. So then it is even more clear that you created something and kind of we appreciate that there's a lump sum and that's the end of it. But yeah, IPRs are something that, because they're very I think a lot of shareholders agree, shareholders don't even kind of maybe even can imagine how vast kind of the range of different IPRs there are, and it could be from a logo, from a design, from a kind of copyright. So there might be something that they didn't even think that would transfer to the company. So yeah, there might be something that would come as a dispute between the shareholders later on.
Yep, and then going on to investors. So it is important that investors are not just thought of as a source of funding. Of course, it is a situation where, and often is a situation where a startup is in dire need of funds and really needs money to keep on going. But again, the situation is you're tying yourself to a party, their sort of vision for your product. So it is important to understand who you're making an investment, or who is making the investment, and what they can bring along with the money to help the company scale up. So you want to be there because you will be tied to that party for the rest of the time that the investor is involved. You want to make sure that the sort of chemistry between you, the co-founders, and the investor is good. The investor is bringing more than just the funding, although this can be in certain situations only what is needed. It is good to understand that the investor might have their own vision for the company, and to see if it aligns with the co-founders, so that you avoid possible disputes in the future with investors, as essentially you are working towards the same goal. But of course, the co-founders have the vision where they want to take their product and their company. So this is something you really, really want to avoid, especially if you need to at some point buy out a certain investor to be able to continue with the company. And then a novelty is the late subscription of shares, which may happen with advisors. So something is promised to an advisor, a certain amount of shares, a certain amount of options. Essentially, shares is where the issue would come along. Essentially, that the company has promised a certain amount of shares at a certain price in the beginning when the company has started. And it has taken some time for the company to get going, let's say 2-3 years, and has never actually made the share transfer or the right to their shares to the certain advisor, for example. And at that stage, when there is an agreement for the price and the shares to be handed over, firstly, the negotiation of how to go about whether the advisor is willing to pay for a larger price or whether if this is something that has been described before, but also then possible tax implications that come along with the shares being undervalued with regards to the company at that stage, or how investors, for example, might feel about someone coming on board with a certain percentage or a certain amount of shares, which they get for a price which is way under what they have been investing in. So these are matters that come up later on, but are things that if you take the time and the process that every time an advisor comes on board, a shareholder comes on board, everything is written down and registered. These are the best ways to avoid such issues in general. So just the key point is to keep in mind that the more matters are settled, written down, and clear to all the parties involved, the more you will sort of not have these issues coming up. Although, as Maria was saying, when parties come together and make an agreement, the agreement is agreed together in a sort of mutual understanding. But at the point where there is an issue, both parties will have their own view of what has been written down and how it's been written down, which is why the clearer you write something down, the better. And even having annotations on the side of the agreement comments where it explains what the parties have meant, it gives more context to the direction of where the parties who are agreeing, which way they want to interpret the clause or the matter that's being questioned. But that being said, we'd like to hear about your experiences, any comments you might have with regards to shareholders agreements or investments, or getting an investor on board or an advisor on board, or issues that you might have been facing. Now, I'm sharing the screen currently, so Maria, if you can see if there are any comments.
I'll keep my eye on it. Does anyone? There's even a possibility for questions and answer. You need to pose the questions to the audience. If you don't have any thoughts, you can always come back to us later on as well. There's our contact details. And we'll stick around for a bit longer if anyone has any questions or thoughts. I would definitely like to thank you for participating this morning. It was a nice, bish bash bosh, 40 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. It wasn't too long. And hopefully you all enjoy this lovely day. Let's see if I got a question now. Yes, I got a question from Beik Hamekoski. Are there any good thumb rules for the amount of stock reserved for options for employees or advisors? Do you have any thoughts on that, Juuso?
With regards to any rules of thumb, essentially, it is how
the amount of stock reserved for options for employees or advisors.
With regards to employees, often a stock option pool is something around 10% mark. maybe below the 10% mark, but often I bumped into that shareholders wish to reserve that 10% for the options. That being said, it's also something that needs to be written down and registered. So having it written down in the shareholders agreement that you want to reserve 10% for option pool does not actually create the option pool and the right to essentially give out options, but the actual option needs to be registered with the patent and registry authority. So, but yes, to go back to that, 10% is often a number that I've bumped into at this stage. With regards to advisors, it really depends on the value that the advisor brings in, whether it's a percentage, whether it's a few percents. But then again, inflating the amount of shareholders at the beginning could be an issue later on down the line, where it starts to actually affect the decision-making process. So bringing on any shareholder and the percentage that they own should not just be based on, okay, well, we have shares to hand over, but rather, what will it do down the line? How might it affect the company down the line? So yeah. Maria, I seem to see that there are a few more questions.
Yes, I just got a thank you from Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
And Peg just put a thumb up for us for the answer. In my understanding, also employees, they're usually reserved some percentage, so not massive amounts. Jari Pauna is asking, what would you recommend if there's a valid shareholders agreement and a co-founder leaves and establishes a competing company with the same idea?
Then essentially these are matters that then have to be resolved via the actual shareholders agreement and what has been set down in the shareholders agreement to see how to go forward with the matter. Again, this is something that as Maria and I have been saying throughout the morning, the more that has been set down in the actual shareholders agreement, the more how clearly matters have been set down, it will then essentially resolve the dispute, hopefully. Otherwise, then it may need negotiation, it may need mediation to go forward, or then whatever else, let's say court cases or otherwise. But of course, going to court will always affect both the new company and the existing share or company. So it is a situation that is of course difficult for both parties.
Yes, yeah, first thing is obviously to look if there's anything in the shareholders agreement to see how to move a way forward. And also just a quick note about the kind of dispute like resolution, mediation. Yeah, definitely the first like recommended way forward. And then regarding court and arbitration, court proceedings are always non-confidential, and arbitration is. So if there's any kind of matters that you want to keep secret, or just to kind of, you know, in general, you don't want the shareholders disputes to go public, then our arbitration is probably the way forward after the mediation. So everything is kept confidential.
Yeah. And it is good to have the mention of confidentiality also within the arbitration clause, so that although the decisions may be confidential, it would be good that anything in the process is also to be kept confidential. And again, to essentially write down everything that is thought of at the beginning, that the parties want to have it a certain way. Let's say the proceedings to be kept confidential, the better it is to actually write it down so that it's clear to all the parties. With regards to court and arbitration has often been seen as a less expensive approach and a less time-consuming approach, but unfortunately the matter is sort of in a balanced situation where arbitration has become almost as a slow proceeding as going to court, depending of course on the court which is decided to resolve the matter. So in that sense, it is a more viable option to essentially, in the beginning, to have a mediator, or then to try and mediate between the parties themselves to resolve the decision, to essentially save any possible costs that might be involved in a dispute. Also, Robert said how many days it usually takes to prepare a solid shareholders agreement. It really depends on how many parties are involved. The more parties involved, the more negotiation it will require. So essentially a template may take somewhere between half a week to a week where everyone signs on to the agreement, but the more negotiation that comes on, there are shareholder agreement negotiations that have gone on for months. So it really depends.
Yeah, I agree. If there's only a few of you, 2-3 days could even be enough if you're in agreement with each other. Robert says thanks. Anything else? Any other questions or thoughts or experiences?
If not, as Maria said before, you can reach out to us. I see, is there any more questions? But if not, like Maria said, you can reach out to us through our email addresses and or through the growth.lexia.fi portal that we have just opened a few months ago. And do be sure to check it out if you have the chance. But otherwise, I think we can end the slideshow. So from my point of view as well, thank you for participating and thank you for the questions. And be sure to join us in our next Growth Academy, which is on the 22nd of September, and which will be discussing funding from a few perspectives, and from the perspective at least of convertible notes. That being said, Maria, any final thoughts?
No, except I think the growth website link is in our thank you email. So don't worry if you don't know what it is or you want to look into it. You'll get the link in the kind of thank you for participating email. So you can check it from there. But thank you very much. Have a lovely day, everyone. And see you soon in the next webinar, or maybe even via email.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.